Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here this morning in a beautiful country to talk to you a little bit more about the applied side. What a thought-provoking talk. Really enjoyed the presentation there. Going to take a little bit of a transition now into the technologies and how we might apply them on farms, and using specifically the dairy farm as an example. So our group at the University of Kentucky has worked a lot in this area of precision livestock farming, precision dairy farming over the last 10 years or so. There's a large group of people that have helped us learn what we've learned so far, and we've worked at many different levels, from technology development to technology implementation, whether that be on a research farm or on commercial farms, to understanding the sociology of technology adoption and the economics of technology adoption. So this is something that we think a lot about, and I'm glad to hear the stage set that I'm not going to be the only one that says this isn't all rainbows and sunshine. There are some challenges that we have to think about, and I want to make sure we talk through some of those things. Lots of neat opportunities, lots of exciting opportunities within precision livestock farming, but a whole lot of things that we need to think about before we all jump on the bandwagon and say this is going to change our world.
A dairy cow that talks to farmers. What kind of sorcery is that? It's not the magic wand kind. It's the RFID collar and Internet of Things kind we created with Chiddly Dairy. So every cow can let farmers know how she feels and what she needs to be healthier. All with a simple text. Ta-da! Magic can't make digital transformation happen, but we can. That's the power of VMware, part of Dell Technologies.
I show that commercial to demonstrate how big this area is, because this is not just our traditional players in the livestock industry involved in precision dairy, precision livestock farming. We have major players at the information technology level that are investing in these technologies. It may not always be obvious to everyone that they're playing in this field, but behind the scenes, they're investing in all of this because they see the potential for these technologies. So before we go further, I want to talk a little bit about what we mean when we refer to precision dairy monitoring. And basically, with precision dairy monitoring, we are measuring some variable at the cow level. We might be measuring something in the milk, we might be measuring something behaviorally or physiologically, or we might be looking at the conformation of the animal. And in general, what we're doing is we're measuring these same variables across time, and oftentimes using sort of a management by exception approach to assess an animal or a situation that needs some kind of a different action. There are a lot of different applications for precision dairy monitoring. The one that we're probably the most familiar with is estrus detection. That's been the most widely adopted and successfully adopted within our industry. There are also a lot of potential for things like mastitis detection, fresh cow disease detection, lameness detection, calving detection, a whole new array of genetic traits that are becoming possible to us through monitoring with these technologies. And of course, not only are we able to monitor and measure things at the animal level, but we're able to use that data together and monitor groups of animals or herds of animals. Big data, we had a nice introduction as to what that is. Certainly, it's a little bit of a nebulous term that's sometimes a bit hard to get our minds wrapped around, but basically it has to do with these volume, velocity, veracity, and variety of data, and we certainly are applying this in our dairy industry more and more every day. But in reality, I think we've been using some form of big data for the last 50 or 60 years. What the difference is now is our computing capabilities and the amount of data that we're able to collect. And some people have gone as far to describe this whole area of big data applied to agriculture as the next green revolution. And I think that really it is a huge area of opportunity for us to continue to improve our livestock productivity as we look toward feeding an increasingly large population. What we can end up with this kind of technology is this kind of a dashboard where we have multiple variables on the same animal, and we can identify basically almost anything we would want to know about that particular animal. And we have, in general, some kind of an identifier indicating that one of these variables is a little bit different than what we'd like to see. Either that's some kind of a general standard, or comparing to that particular animal's own baseline, or comparing her to other animals within the herd. Elon showed a similar slide earlier, but basically we look around the cow and we can see that if we had the opportunity to ask her what's going on, there are a lot of different things that she could say. And this is by no means a full limit of what is possible for that animal to tell us. But it quickly becomes an issue of what do we want to measure? Because I'm quite positive that if I could measure all these things, and I'm a dairy farmer, I don't necessarily want to measure all those things. And even if I do want to measure them, I probably can't afford to measure all those things. So this brings the question, what do we need to measure? And I think as an industry as a whole, we probably don't really know that answer fully at this point. I think we have a lot of questions left to answer about which of these variables provide us the most useful, the most actionable, and the most economic information that we can use on our operations. So I like to think about what kinds of criteria we would look for within a technology. The first criteria that I use is that the technology has to explain some kind of an underlying biological process. It has to explain something that's going on within that animal. But not only that, it needs to be something that we can turn into a meaningful action. Just because I know something doesn't mean I can do anything about that. So it's quite important that we be able to have some kind of action that we can take if needed with this particular information. It's quite important that these technologies are cost effective, that they are flexible, robust, and reliable. It's a very difficult environment that we're asking these technologies to survive in. I think it's important that these technologies are simple in concept and solution focused. Too many times I get calls from companies that have some kind of a technology and they say, where can I apply this on your farm? Well, I'm more interested in thinking about moving from the animal to the technology as opposed to the technology to the animal. And lastly, the information has to be in a readily available format. It needs to be something that's broken down to where if I'm a dairy producer, I don't have to look at that kind of a dashboard that shows me 10 different variables on every cow to be able to know what to do in a day. We need to refine that information in a way that the dairy producer can do something with it. And we look across the industry, the options for these technologies are really quite endless. It seems like every month or every other month there's some brand new idea that comes out on the market. And from a dairy producer perspective or livestock producer perspective, it's very difficult to think about, if I do decide I want a technology, which ones of these technologies should I invest in? And this part of what we do at the University of Kentucky is we're looking at a lot of these different technologies and trying to use them on the same set of animals so that we can determine if we have variable X, Y, and Z, which ones of these variables provide us the most useful, actionable information for whichever scenario we're looking at. There are a lot of different technologies that have been on the market now that are wearable technologies based on an accelerometer that measure lying time. So tell us a lot about the activity of the animal, the comfort of the animal. Other devices that are ear-based that can measure things like rumination time or eating time or maybe even body temperature. Many neck tags that are measuring some of those same variables. In addition to that, some are now looking at variables related to grazing time. Rumen devices, these are promoted to either measure rumen temperature or rumen pH. Others that have been promoted as possibly measuring things like rumen motility. There are a few different calving detection devices that have been on the market. One of them would be using a device that goes into the vagina. This is measuring temperature. There's a dramatic drop that occurs 24 to 48 hours before calving that would identify that this animal is going to have a calf within that time frame. The other is an accelerometer-based device that goes on the tail, and this is looking at the motion around calving to identify more specifically this animal is actually in the calving process now. And then, of course, we have much more than just wearable technologies. We have a lot of different technologies that are monitoring in the parlor or in the robotic milking system. So things like the Eaap milk system that use spectroscopy to look at fat, protein, or lactose in the milk. The herd navigator system, which measures progesterone, LDH, an enzyme for an early indication of mastitis and BHBA levels. We have multiple technologies now that are able to measure somatic cell count, each milking for each animal. And then we move into the exciting area of image analysis. So we have now our first system out that DeLaval is marketing for using automatic body condition scoring through image analysis. Then we have real-time location systems. So this is really an amazing amount of data, basically providing us with XY coordinates for where every animal is every second of the day, and how we can use that information to understand where animals are spending their time, how they change where they're spending their time, how they're reacting to their physical environment, I think provides us a whole lot of potential exciting areas. And then newer technologies now even looking at using a series of cameras to monitor behavior. So cameras that would identify specific behaviors to indicate when the animal's eating, trying to get at some indication of intake, certainly not necessarily dry matter intake, but an idea of how much time the cow spends eating. And then even some neat ideas, basically combining an older type of a system, a scratch-off pad for estrus detection, where the animal walks under this device here, and image analysis identifies how much of that pad has been scratched off as an indication that this animal should be sorted off because she's in heat. A lot of what we talk about in precision livestock monitoring is about disease detection. The idea behind disease detection with these technologies is that perhaps we can use a technology to detect disease earlier than what we would be able to do just through visual observation. And of course, the implication there is that this might help us improve our treatment results. And if we can improve our treatment results, then we have longer living animals, problems associated with disease, reduced expenses, et cetera. I think one of the important things that we need to remember here, though, is that there's actually not a lot of data indicating this is really the case, indicating that if we do intervene, that we're going to be able to reduce the impact of the disease. And oftentimes people make the assumption that if we've detected the disease, then we avoided all the cost of the disease. But that's definitely not the case. If we've detected the disease, the animal still has the disease, and we're only going to eliminate some of the cost associated with that particular condition. And it is really neat and exciting to look at some of these variables and compare animals with or without a condition and see what kinds of differences we picked up. So this is some work out of one of my graduate students, Nikki Tai, looking at cows with or without subclinical hyperketonemia. And we can see from this graph that the cows without subclinical hyperketonemia ruminated more than the cows that did. Or we can look here and see that the fat-protein ratio becomes higher at about day 3 for cows that had hyperketonemia than cows that didn't. Or we can look at something like milk fever and see that cows that had milk fever, subclinical milk fever even, spent more time lying down. And there are multiple papers that look at this sort of thing, and I think this is an important question to answer and interesting biologically, but it's not enough. We have to go beyond this. These are differences to actually see what kinds of actions that we can take. So the question becomes, how good are we at finding the events of interest? And we have to think about it in these terms. We think about it in terms of type 1 and type 2 errors. And for those of you that might not understand basic statistics, this is a pretty good example. The false positive Is hopefully this guy saying that this other guy is pregnant. He's probably not, so that's a false positive. Then we have the false negative, this lady saying that this woman's not pregnant. Now, I know from experience that's not something I would ever say to anybody, but with that we have a clear example of a false negative. So how do we take that to our dairy operation? If we have 100 events, so for example, if we have 100 metritis events, and I have a technology that identifies 80 of them, and it misses 20 of them, then I have what we call an 80% sensitivity. The flip side of that question is if I have 100 alerts indicating that that animal has metritis, and 90 of them are for cows that actually have metritis, and 10 of them are for cows that do not, then I have a 90% specificity. So in this case, we have a combination of 80% sensitivity, 90% specificity. And those numbers, if we think about it, actually seem a little bit low. That means we're missing quite a few events, but we have a lot of alerts that are not really real. But the reality is, when it comes to disease detection, we rarely achieve levels this high. If we have 10 false alerts for every 100 events, or for every 100 alerts, that's a lot of time that I'm going to spend looking at animals that don't have anything wrong with them. And the other challenge that we have here is that these two numbers are always fighting against each other. I can always make any technology perfect for one or the other, but when I change my alert level, I change what happens with the other one. And here's what happens in reality, unfortunately. This is some data from one of my students, Elizabeth Eckelkamp, where we have the pink bars indicate where a technology indicated something was wrong with the cow. The blue stars are when there was actually something wrong with the cow, whether that was identified by us in our research or by the farmer. And what you see here is a lot of mismatches. You see a lot of times when you have an alert with nothing going on with the animal. You have times when you have something going on with the animal and it didn't pick up anything. And we have a lot of alerts. This is 2 cows with about 4 months of data for each of these 2 cows. And look how many alerts that we have. In this study, we had about 1,000 cows that we followed for a year. And there were 26,000 alerts for those 1,000 cows. It's really amazing to see what happens with the farmers. So we had the farmers actually record, what do you do with these alerts? Exactly half of the time they looked and they said, okay, there's an alert, I'm not going to worry about it, I'm not going to go check the animal. 16% of the time they just said, I don't believe the alert. Only 1/3 of the time did they go look at the animal. They ignored the alerts. And guess what? When we have 26,000 alerts and 1,000 cows over a year, across time, they start looking at fewer and fewer of them because they become less sure about the type of alert that they're going to get. So they lose faith in the system. I really think this is an important example because I think we have a lot of technologies being marketed to our farmers for disease detection that actually don't necessarily do that good of a job at disease detection. And then we have a lot of wasted time chasing animals that don't need to be chased, or we lose faith in the system. And we need to be asking more of these questions about if we're going to provide this alert, how accurate is that alert? So here's an example of exactly that kind of trick that we can easily play. So this is one data set where we looked at cows days 1 to 14 in milk, and we can see, looking at a few different variables here, the cows that were sick ruminated more than the cows that didn't. The cows that had metritis had a higher temperature than cows that didn't. The cows that were lying down, the cows that were sick spent less time lying down, and they provided more milk. So when we look at it this way, it looks really good. But when we try to break this down in terms of sensitivity and specificity, we get some really, really poor results. So we have 98% sensitivity with 6% specificity. Tons and tons of false positives. Or we have just an okay a coin flip of sensitivity with decent specificity. And you see that trend for each condition. So we have to be asking a bit more difficult question to get at this, because this is really what the farmer is going to experience. There are a lot of questions that we have about how we handle the data. If I have an alert, what am I supposed to do with that alert? What protocol should I take if I have an animal that the system says is sick, but she's not really sick? What do I do about natural reactions of healthy cows? Sometimes we have an increase in somatic cell count, and that's an indication that that animal does have a mastitis infection, but she's fighting the infection and she deals with it and didn't need any kind of intervention. What do we do about alerts that repeat each other, devices that fail? What do we do when we have a system outage? When the system goes down for a couple of days? And then, like was mentioned earlier, the data security and ownership issues. I think we have some real questions about how much information we really need. Are we focused too heavily on detection and not enough on prevention? I hear lots of discussion about lameness detection, for example, and we work on lameness detection. But if I'm a herd that has 60% lameness rate, I don't need a technology to tell me that. I need to fix the reason why I have that high of a lameness incidence. This is a friend of mine, a farmer in Kentucky, and he's probably taught me one of the most valuable things about technologies. The people that understand cows, the people that really have good husbandry skills, are the ones that are going to benefit the most from a technology. We cannot get a technology and think it's magically going to fix our problems. If I'm a bad manager before a technology, I'm probably still going to be a bad manager after the technology. And these technologies don't eliminate the need for human skill, they increase the need for human skill. These technologies mean that we need to have more trained people working with our animals on our farms. We've learned, unfortunately, that there are real issues like raccoons. Raccoons love to eat Cat5 cable. This is a real issue on farms. Lightning strikes are a huge issue, so there are very practical issues like this that we have to think about. I think sometimes we need to make sure we're measuring the targets we intend to. Too often we see something that says it's measuring X, and it's not necessarily measuring X. And we need third-party validations to make sure these technologies are really doing what they say they're doing. This is some data from one of our studies where we had multiple technologies on the same cows. You see we have 3 different technologies here measuring rumination time. And on average, there was 100 minutes difference in the rumination time per day. On average, there were 3 hours difference in line time per day. And on average, 2,000 steps difference. Same cows. Which one of these technologies is right? I don't know, but they're definitely not all measuring the same thing. And then we have issues of disappearing data. We thought it would be great if we put these technologies on the cows, we would measure and pull different variables that weren't necessarily on the same technology system and see if we could come up with a better algorithm for disease detection. We had 2,900 cow days on this study, but only 29% of the time were all the technologies working. They were all randomly dying at different points. With that kind of failure rate, we can't expect to get the results that we're hoping for. We have to remember there's lots and lots of within cow and within herd variation. We have management factors and environmental conditions that we have to take into consideration. Sometimes tags randomly stop reading. It's amazing because sometimes they stop for a couple weeks and they come back to life. How we place the tags is very important. Group changes, pin changes affect a lot of the behaviors no matter what. Some cows just don't seem to read the book with what they're supposed to do. And we tend to think about a linear world, but not all the changes that we see are linear. We see lots of nonlinear relationships, and we can easily overlook those if we only look at linear analyses. We'll finish up quickly by talking about some of the opportunities. These are the top 10 opportunities that I see for precision dairy monitoring. First of all, data integration. This is our biggest limit and our lowest ceiling, is that we have all these different technologies and they don't talk to each other well. So until we can get systems that allow us to bring the data together, we're only going to be able to accomplish so much. I think we need to do a lot more in terms of understanding technology economics. Many times we're talking about investments of hundreds of thousands of dollars and doing this investment without making an actual investment analysis to see if that makes sense. Customer service is really critical. We have to make sure if we're going to invest in the technology, there's good customer service. I think we need to have more farmer user groups, people working together, using the technology, seeing how they're using them together on farms. We have opportunities for group or herd level data. This data is probably most useful within herds. We have to be really cautious when we're comparing across herds, particularly if we're comparing two different technologies that are supposedly measuring the same thing when they may not necessarily be measuring that. And we need to remember things like natural variation and lag. And I think there's a lot of opportunities for creating cow-responsive environments. So if we have, for example, a technology that can measure body temperature, that is tied into a control center that determines when we turn on our fans, when we turn on our sprinklers, or even if we have a technology that's indicating where the animals are, and we have a sprinkler system which uses a lot of water, that it only turns the sprinklers on when cows are actually standing there. So lots of opportunities that we have for improving the environments that we have when we're able to actually measure the cow's response to her environment. For whatever reason, calves have largely been ignored, and I think there are a lot of opportunities for monitoring calves. Genetic evaluations, really probably the largest potential gain from these technologies. We have new traits, improved traits that we are able to measure with these technologies, better data accuracy, lots of synergies with genomics, and I think there's a lot of neat potential for using image analysis to get linear traits. And in the end, right now, we see a lot of technologies that are wearable technologies, but moving forward, I think we'll see more of a shift toward image technologies. There's so much potential for what we can do with image analysis and more that we can measure within the milk. So lots of biomarkers that we're going to be able to measure in the parlor that can provide us more information. And I think the interesting thing when we get into the milk is we're looking more physiologically at what's going on with that animal instead of just looking at behaviorally. So there's a little bit of an overview of precision dairy. I hope that you have at least thought a little bit more about some of the new challenges that we have. And I appreciate your invitation again to come speak here today, and thank you for your attention.